The valley was closing in like a fist. 100 American commandos were trapped deep behind enemy lines, cut off, surrounded on all sides. Their radios crackled with broken calls. Their ammo was down to the last magazines. Enemy fire poured from the ridges, mortars thumping closer with each strike. Above them, the sky was clear but silent. 2 enemy missile batteries waited, daring any aircraft to try. Command at headquarters had already begun drafting the unthinkable, a loss report for 100 men who would never make it home. But in that silence, one pilot made a choice. She refused to let the valley become their grave. While others saw a death trap, she saw a way in, a way only skill, courage, and precision could carve. She wasn't authorized, she wasn't cleared. But she was ready. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love seeing our Army family spread across the world. Captain Avery Morgan's name carried weight on the flight line, but not the kind her commanders appreciated. At 29, she was already known as one of the most skilled hands on an F-16, a pilot who could feel the machine through every vibration in the stick and every hum in the engine. Yet in every closed-door meeting, the same words trailed after her like chains: too aggressive, reckless, not ready for command. To the ground crews who fueled her jet, loaded her weapons, and wiped sweat from their brows under desert heat, she was something else entirely. They knew she checked her own bolts before every sortie, ran her hand along the fuselage as if the aircraft were alive, and studied the terrain not because she had to, but because she refused to ever be caught unprepared. They trusted her in ways paper rank never measured. But trust from the bottom seldom outweighed suspicion from the top, so the higher-ups kept her sidelined. They pushed her toward routine training flights, formation drills with rookies, or endless briefings where she was expected to nod and stay quiet. In the hangar, she'd smile, but in her bunk at night, the truth pressed harder. She wasn't being tested, she was being contained. That's when her second life began. Long after lights out, Avery would spread maps across her desk, the kind of paper creased so many times the corners threatened to tear. She studied valleys the way others studied novels. Every fold, every ridge, every contour line committed to memory. She traced them with her finger until her mind could fly them in the dark. She ran mental calculations on distances, ballistics, fuel burn, and escape routes. Where doctrine said no solution, Avery made herself find one. She practiced low-altitude runs other pilots avoided, diving into terrain so close the jet's shadow skimmed rock and dirt. She pulled up at the last possible second, heart steady, breaths measured. In simulators, she wrote her own scenarios, dozens of them. Friendlies surrounded, danger close fire, anti-air batteries that made the skies untouchable. Time and again, she fought those ghosts, each time carving new paths through impossible traps. The others joked she was obsessive. To Avery, it was preparation. Luck favors the ready, her father used to say, and she believed it with everything in her. Her father was the reason she wore the uniform at all. A Vietnam veteran, he carried his own battles quietly. When Avery was a child, she'd find him in the garage, staring at a box of medals he never bragged about. He never spoke much of the war, but sometimes, when the air turned heavy and he thought she wasn't listening, he'd whisper about the men who didn't come back. He would touch the dog tags that never left his pocket, and once he told her, "These aren't mine, they're borrowed. They belong to the ones who never made it home." When she earned her wings, he pressed those same tags into her hand. "Carry them," he said. Not for luck, for memory. From that day forward, they hung against her chest under every flight suit, resting over her heartbeat, a promise she could never break. Ink marked another part of her story. On her wrist, just under the sleeve of her flight jacket, a small tattoo showed the outline of rotor wings, a tribute not to her own branch, but to the rescue pilots and crews who had saved countless lives. She'd gotten it the day she graduated, a silent reminder of what flying was really about, not medals, not glory, but giving others a road home when none seemed possible. People mistook her fire for recklessness, her intensity for immaturity. What they never understood was that every so-called reckless decision was backed by hours of unseen work. Avery didn't just fly, she rehearsed every angle of survival until it lived in her bones. While others memorized checklists, she memorized terrain. While others stopped when the simulator shut down, she stayed after hours, running the same nightmare mission until she could execute it blindfolded. She wasn't reckless, she was ready. And when the day came that 100 Americans were staring down the end of their story, Captain Avery Morgan would be the only one who had already written a different ending. The desert sun had already started its slow descent when the first call cut through the routine hum of the ops center. Static hissed, broken by a strained voice. "Command, this is Talon Actual. We are surrounded. Enemy contact on 3 ridgelines. Request immediate air support." Heads turned. Screens lit up with feeds from drones circling high above the valley. 100 American Commandos, Talon Company, were pinned in terrain that looked more like a crucible than a battlefield. A narrow bowl of rock and dust had become a trap, enemy fighters tightening the noose with every passing minute. Mortars landed closer. Muzzle flashes stitched the ridges. The analysts called it what it was, a kill box. To make matters worse, 2 SAM sites had been spotted crouched on opposing ridges, their launchers camouflaged beneath netting. Any attempt to send helicopters would end in fireballs before they reached the valley floor. Fast movers were no better. Doctrine forbade danger close runs under 100 meters, and the Commandos were huddled tight, with enemy muzzle flashes as close as 50. Radio traffic grew frantic. One team leader's voice broke as he reported, "Ammo down to 30 minutes, maybe less. Casualties mounting. We can't hold much longer." Inside the ops center, senior officers spoke in clipped tones, as if volume could bend reality. Charts were updated, range circles drawn, strike packages discussed. But every option collapsed against the same wall, the missiles. Without clearing those SAMs, any sortie was suicide. Without air cover, the Commandos would be overrun. A silence fell that was heavier than any explosion. In that silence, the quiet truth took form. The staff was preparing for loss. The phrase, "no one wanted to say," acceptable casualties, hovered unspoken in the air. Someone began drafting a preliminary report, a cold line of text that would be sent to families before the sun rose again. Avery Morgan sat at the edge of the room, helmet still in hand, flight suit half-zipped. She listened as officers traded words like doctrine, risk thresholds, and collateral. None of them mattered. She knew that valley. She had studied its ridgelines under dim light while others slept. She'd memorized the folds and blind corners, the narrow seams where radar beams overlapped and where a jet could hide for precious seconds. Her voice cut into the debate, calm but sharp. "I can make the run. I know that valley. I can mask terrain, take out the SAMs, and clear space for exfil." All eyes turned, some in shock, others in irritation. A colonel shook his head before she'd finished. "Not authorized. Too dangerous. We wait until proper doctrine allows engagement. We will not lose an aircraft." She didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, you're not losing an aircraft. You're losing 100 Americans." The room bristled. Another officer leaned forward, his tone clipped. "Captain Morgan, you are not cleared for a combat sortie." "Stand down." The words stung, not because they were new, but because she'd heard them all her life. Too aggressive. Reckless. Not ready. But on the other end of the radio, voices of Commandos still fighting for their lives bled through. "This is Talon 2. We're holding, but we're out of time. They're inside 200 meters. Avery clenched her fists until the dog tags pressed sharp into her palm. Her father's words echoed. Luck favors the ready. She wasn't reckless. She was ready. She stood, helmet tucked under her arm, and walked out of the ops center without waiting for another order. The silence behind her said everything. Most of them thought she was walking away in frustration. They didn't realize she was walking toward her jet. In the locker room, she scribbled a single line on the back of a folded letter she'd kept in her flight bag for months. "If you're reading this, I chose to act when 100 Americans had no one else left." She tucked it back inside, zipped her suit, and felt the weight of her father's dog tag steady her heartbeat. The flight line stretched ahead, shimmering in the late sun. Her F-16 sat waiting, a crouched predator with fuel tanks full and weapons armed. Crews nearby glanced up in confusion as she approached, but none moved to stop her. They knew the look in her eyes. In the tower, clearance officers would deny her request before she even asked. On the command net, she'd already been silenced. But on the open guard channel, where every pilot in the theater could hear, her voice came steady and uncompromising. "Any station, this is Falcon 2, departing on unauthorized mission. Inbound to support 100 Americans trapped behind enemy lines. Breaking every rule if that's what it takes to bring them home." The ground crews froze, then stepped back as the engine roared to life. The canopy dropped. Dust swirled. Wheels lifted from tarmac. Avery Morgan was going alone. ChatGPT said Avery's hand shook only once when the pen touched paper. On the back of the folded letter she had carried for months, she wrote a single line: "If you're reading this, I couldn't stand by while 100 Americans died." She slipped it back into her bag, zipped it tight, and pressed her palm flat over her father's dog tags, as if sealing the promise with his memory. The hangar outside buzzed with ordinary life crews rolling fuel hoses, hydraulics whining, mechanics shouting over each other. To Avery, the noise fell away. Her F-16 sat waiting, gray paint dulled by sun, pylons bristling with ordnance, a full drum of 20mm, Mavericks slung under wings, tanks topped for range. She had walked this checklist 1,000 times in training, but tonight it was muscle memory sharpened to steel. Oil pressure, hydraulics, countermeasures. Every system pinged green as her hands moved with practiced precision. From the tower, the first call came sharp. "Falcon 2, hold position. You are not cleared for departure." She didn't answer. Another voice piled on, firmer, more urgent. "Captain Morgan, return to ready room. This is not your mission." Her jaw tightened as she lowered the canopy, the hiss of seals drowning out the words. Inside, the cockpit became a sanctuary of switches and glass, the only world that mattered. She pushed the throttle forward. The jet growled to life, engine whine climbing until it became a roar that swallowed every objection. Her crew chief stood back, helmet tucked under one arm, expression unreadable. Then, just as the wheel chocks were pulled, he raised a hand, a silent salute. She nodded once. The radio crackled again. "Falcon 2, abort takeoff. Repeat, abort." This time she keyed up, but not on the tower's net. Instead, her voice carried across the open guard frequency, the channel every pilot and air controller in theater monitored, from tanker crews to forward observers in foxholes. "Any station, Falcon 2 departing. Heading to rescue 100 Americans behind enemy lines. Breaking rules to bring them home." Every headset went silent. For a heartbeat, all anyone could hear was the rising howl of her engine as she released brakes. The jet lunged forward, tires shrieking against concrete before biting into speed. The desert blurred at the edges of her canopy. At 150 knots, she pulled back, and the F-16 leapt free of gravity. She climbed not into open sky, but into the narrow corridor of risk she had studied by lamplight, her nose angled east toward the valley. Radar swept wide. Chaff and flare dispensers cycled live. Hands steady, eyes locked forward, she slid low across the desert floor. In the ops center, disbelief rippled across the room. Some cursed her name. Others muttered prayers. A colonel barked for interceptors to bring her back, only to be reminded there was nothing on deck fast enough to catch her now. She was already gone, her call sign echoing across the guard net like a gauntlet thrown at fate. Back in the cockpit, Avery's world narrowed to altitude, speed, and distance. The SAMs would be waiting, and she knew they'd light her up the moment she came within range. But she had trained for this, mapping every ridge, every fold of rock that might shield her for seconds at a time. This was no reckless gamble. It was the culmination of years of preparation, written in sweat and sleepless nights. She glanced once at the dog tags resting over her chest, metal cool against her skin. Then she breathed out slow, tightened her grip on the stick, and pressed the jet lower until the desert itself seemed to hold her in its arms. Falcon 2 was airborne, alone, and on her way into the most dangerous mission of her life. By the time Falcon 2 broke the horizon over the valley, the picture on Avery's HUD matched the one she'd traced 100 nights in the dark, only this time the stakes were painfully, undeniably real. Below, the Commandos crouched like a ragged star in the bowl, tiny blue strobes, dark human shapes, smoke curling from a collapsed bunker where medics clustered. Around them, the ridgelines bristled with men, with machine guns, and with shadowed emplacements no drone could unmask without drawing fire. An estimate on the datalink put enemy fighters in the area at 800 and climbing. The valley smelled of cordite even from up high. The optics painted a living map of danger. 2 SAM sites sat like coiled vipers, camouflaged twice, and waiting for the heat of a jet to make them visible. They weren't theoretical hazards in a book. They were active, scanning, ready to track. A single missile on the wrong vector could turn the whole rescue into a funeral pyre. Avery's hands moved with the discipline of someone who had repeated this choreography until it lived in her muscles. She throttled down, trading height for cover, and rode the contours of the terrain. From 10,000 feet she slid to 3,000, then to a hair-raising few hundred, low enough that the jet's shadow skated across the rocks, low enough that radar returns would bounce and blur. She used terrain masking, a ridge here, a fold of rock there, seconds of invisibility bought by physics and guts. Every second mattered. On her first pass, she pulled a hot, tight slice along the southern lip. Her targeting pod painted a dark cluster of camel and netting where the southern SAM had been sighted. She locked a Maverick, waited for the fold in the ridge to shield the launch, and then let the missile go. The Maverick punched into a seam of rock and netting. The site erupted in a bloom of dust and flame. For a heartbeat, the valley's radio traffic went from ragged to stunned. A seeker tone bled in her ear. Another launcher had tried to illuminate. She dumped chaff and spun flares, throwing false heat into the sky. The warning tones jumped and cracked. One seeker wobbled and then went silent. She dove behind the next ridge, heartbeat sinking to the engine's wail, and watched the wave of radar contacts roll harmlessly over the crest. That first hit changed the calculus. Helicopters might still have been a suicide run if both SAMs were hot, remove one, and the path opened enough for a sliver of hope. She called down on the ground frequency and heard it like a prayer. Talon actual, Falcon 2, southern launcher neutralized. You're a godsend. The voice was raw, muffled by dust and adrenaline, but it steadied the room in her head. She didn't celebrate. There was a long list of things that could still go wrong. The Commandos began to paint their positions with IR strobes, tiny, deliberate beacons that would show up on her targeting pod, but remain invisible to anything lacking the right sensor. That tiny act changed everything. Where before her guns were blind to friend from foe in the clutter of rock, the strobes gave her a mental grid. She lined up the first gun run. Gun runs are measured in millimeters and seconds. The M61 Vulcan chews lead at 6-barrel roar, and the rounds fly like a curtain. A half-second too long, a degree too high, and a life becomes collateral. Avery breathed, counted the ridge seam in her head, and then rolled the jet into a shallow dive that put her 40 meters from the nearest friendly strobe. Her trigger finger squeezed for a quarter second, and the cannon stitched a short, controlled arc across a machine gun nest. Stone exploded. A cone of red dust blossomed, and the muzzle flashes below stuttered and then stopped. Over the radio, Falcon 2, that's our east gun. Good effect. Move west. She flipped the jet, climbed under the lee of rock where the SAM radar could overshoot her, and re-entered the bowl for another pass. Each run was a surgical edit, a burst here to cut a spotter, a short tap there to suppress an MG ring. She paced her firing to conserve ammo and to keep the dust as a veil for the Commandos. Long streams of fire would have thrown up blinding plumes. Short, controlled bursts let the dust fall and shield movement. On her third pass, a burst of tracer on the north crest flared bright and wrong. an attempted intercept by an enemy truck-mounted gun team. She dove low and fast, the earth skimming at the canopy's edge, and pulled a diagonal gun run that shaved a shallow line into shale and sand. The truck folded inward under the hits, its gun silenced like a cord being cut. Voices in the valley now carried a rhythm. Bound. Bound. Go! They were moving. Back in theater command, someone barked for her to return. Falcon 2, stand down. You are not authorized. RTB immediately. The words came from a channel she'd learned to respect most of her career, the one that kept careers intact and paperwork clean. Tonight, it held little comfort. She keyed the mic on the ground channel instead. Talon Actual, Falcon 2. Keep moving to the west seam. I'll take the north lip in 30 seconds. Bounds of 2 minutes, no more. I'll be on your shoulder. The voice that came back had a grain of something Avery had heard before. Acceptance maybe, or disbelief turned into a brittle, necessary trust. Copy, Falcon 2. We're moving, you're with us. The SAMs scanned, and one of them did what SAMs do best, it tracked. The warning light screamed. Her HUD painted a green cone, then a red triangle. She jammed, ejected flares, and dove into a blind spot her own maps had promised existed. The seeker screamed past, close enough that she could feel the concussion in her teeth, but it missed. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She held the jet low, let the terrain eat the heat signature, and then popped up to paint the next position. Time and again she threaded that needle. A Maverick to take structurally hardened launchers, a shotgun stitch to silence an MG ring, a chaff train to buy the seconds for a dust-shrouded bound. With every micro-action she watched the effect ripple up the radio. A dozen footsteps now, then 40 boots, then the thunder of charges being strapped on, and men beginning to move like a living current finding an exit. Skeptics later would call her audacious. The men in the bowl called it something else. Falcon 2, you're saving our lives, a voice broke through once. Don't stop, she responded with the only thing that mattered, precision. No heroics beyond the math, no theater, just deliberate, measured violence aimed at things that threatened movement. Fuel and ammo were always a shadow at her shoulder. She tracked them like a second pulse. A full gun drum fills and empties in painful arithmetic. Mavericks are finite. Once depleted, the only tool left is the Vulcan's rhythm and the ground's willingness to move. She mixed her tools conservatively, surgical missiles for hardened or mobile threats, cannon for the human knots that a missile couldn't discriminate. And while she worked, the theater's attitude began to shift. Pilots who had been ordered to stay on the ground tuned to her frequency and watched, learning a grammar of terrain and timing they'd never been taught. A tanker answered in the periphery, repositioning for offload if needed. A helicopter squadron, once told to stand down, finally started their rotors and prayed the corridor she'd cut would hold long enough for them to thread in. At one point, the valley spat back a salvo meant to finish the job. An RPG team tried to interdict the LZ as a bird attempted a risky hover. Avery nailed the small crew with a half-second burst that shaved the team's firing solution. The RPG fell harmlessly into a defilade. That was close, a medic said over the net in a voice that sounded like someone who'd been given a second chance. She stayed until the first Chinook skids kissed the valley floor and lifted again, then until the second and the third. She circled like a guardian, not because she wanted glory, but because she could not leave until movement had become exfil. Each liftoff was a small miracle, a cargo ramp heavy with men vaulting into the waiting bird, each man one less responsibility on her conscience. Through it all, higher command's calls continued, threats of grounding, of reprimand, but each time her answer was the same, a focused line of work, the kind that turned doctrine into options. She cut command chatter from her net when it became noise. In that moment, the only conversations that mattered were the ones that moved men out of the valley and into the sky. When the last bird cleared the lip and turned, its rotor wash stirring a new moon of dust, the bowl below was a ghost map of what had been, spent casings, smoldering MG nests, and the blue strobe that had kept them all straight. On the net, a voice came through, not the panicked, broken tone from earlier, but steady, deliberate, incredulous gratitude. Falcon 2, all pelts off the ground. 100 accounted for. No KIA during exfil. Avery let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and kept the jet in a lazy orbit until the last rotor faded into the distance. The valley had been a grave when she arrived. It was a corridor home when she left. 20 minutes into the fight, the numbers began to turn against her. Avery's fuel gauge crept downward faster than she liked, and the green bars showing ammunition left in the Vulcan's drum had shrunk to slivers. The Mavericks were gone. Flares and chaff were half spent. She could hear it in the valley radios. The Commandos were still pinned, though moving more now than before. If she turned for home, they would be swallowed before the rotors ever reached them. Every calculation screamed for withdrawal, except the one that mattered. 100 men alive. 100 lives still depending on the sound of her jet overhead. She adjusted. Long bursts of fire gave way to short, surgical taps, half-second runs at most, each round placed as carefully as if she were threading beads on a string. The thunder of the Vulcan became a rhythm of restraint, conserving not only ammo, but fuel with every pass. Talon, actual to Falcon 2. The ground commander's voice came through, softer this time, not the clipped desperation of the opening minutes. We thought you weren't coming. Now we believe we might make it out. The words were almost a whisper, but Avery felt their weight settle into her chest heavier than any metal, and then something shifted in the net. A voice cut across, not from the ground, but from another cockpit. Falcon 2, this is Raptor 1. We're on station, 30 miles out, no tasking, but if you call it, we'll cover your 6. Another chimed in, Viper flight is monitoring. We're with you if you need to push. Respect, once withheld, now flowed across the ether. Pilots who had been ordered to sit silent were breaking radio discipline, aligning themselves quietly with the one who had acted when no one else would. Back at command, the mood was very different. Senior officers argued across the ops floor, some red-faced, calling for interceptors or a remote override to bring her back. This is insubordination at the highest level, one snapped. She's jeopardizing billions in airframes to play hero. But younger officers, those who had spent time on the ground, who had been close enough to see doctrine fail in real time, pushed back. She's the only reason they're alive right now. Court-martial her if you want, but understand, if she quits, they're dead. We'll be explaining to 100 families why we let red tape kill their sons. The debate raged, but Avery couldn't hear it. She had cut the command net from her headset minutes ago. Her world was reduced to the valley, the dwindling ammo counter, the slow tick of her fuel, and the voices of men whose belief in survival now rested entirely on her wings. Every pass was more dangerous than the last. Every second stretched her odds thinner. Yet with each burst of fire, each careful run down the seams of rock, she could feel the tide changing. They trusted her now. And for the first time, even through the smoke and chaos, she realized she wasn't flying entirely alone anymore. The valley was smoke and chaos, but beneath it, a rhythm had taken shape. Avery's cannon had carved a line west, each short burst cutting open seams in the ridges just wide enough for the Commandos to move. Talon actual, shift left. Stay under the fold, she called, and down below the men moved in disciplined bounds, boots striking dirt in a tempo that answered her Vulcan's beat. Where the enemy rose, she stitched them down. Where the ground threatened to close, she opened it again. Her fuel needle was kissing yellow, the ammo drum a fraction from empty, but it was enough. It had to be. In the distance, she heard it, the thumping thunder of Black Hawk rotors. Helicopters were finally spinning up, their crews gambling that her corridor would hold. The first pair darted over a ridge, blades flashing sunlight, noses dipped into the dust and fire. That's when the valley bit back. A seeker tone screamed in her headset. One Sam, hidden and patient, had waited for this, the moment the slower, heavier helicopters entered the trap. The launch signature blazed on her HUD, a trail of heat streaking upward toward the birds. Avery didn't think. She dove. The F-16 knifed downward so low that rocks blurred beneath her canopy. Flares spat from her wings in blinding streaks, each one a decoy heartbeat. The missile's hungry eyes shifted, tracked the false fire, and then tore itself into a plume against the ridge. The Black Hawks lived, but she wasn't finished. As the dust from the detonation rolled, she yanked the stick, pulled hard into a pop-up climb, and locked her last Maverick onto the launcher site. She fired at the peak of the climb, missile streaking straight into the camouflaged nest. The ridgeline erupted, Earth folding back into fire. The last SAM was gone. "Falcon 2, clear. LZ is open," she shouted across the net. The first Blackhawk dropped into the fold, kicking up a storm of dust. Men sprinted, diving into the belly of the bird. "First chalk loading," came the ground call. Avery circled above, pipper dancing, waiting for any muzzle flash to betray a threat. One stuttered from a rock seam. She silenced it with a tap of cannon fire. "Chalk, one lifting," the crew called, rotors straining, bird clawing skyward. Another dropped in behind it, the second wave racing aboard. Again, Avery's eyes never left the ridges. A machine gun spat on the far slope, desperate to cut the corridor. She answered with a diagonal burst that snapped the fire in half. Chalk 2, lifting. Round after round, helicopter after helicopter, the exfil unfolded under her shield. The radio cadence shifted from desperation to precision. Third chalk loaded, fourth moving. Each phrase carried a confidence no one would have dared an hour ago. On her final orbit, dust clouds churned as the last Black Hawk hovered, rear ramp yawning wide. The final sticks of Commandos sprinted, rearguard firing as they ran. One stumbled, another grabbed him, dragging him into the storm. Avery stitched the ridge behind them, forcing the enemy's heads down until the last man disappeared inside the bird. Then it came, Falcon 2, all 100 accounted for, no KIA during movement. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Avery let out a breath. Her knuckles were white on the stick, sweat running cold beneath her helmet. She should have turned home then, should have preserved what little fuel she had left. But she stayed. She orbited high and wide, her presence a silent guardian, until the very last rotor cleared the valley and faded to a dot against the horizon. Only then did she ease the throttle forward, nose angling homeward. The valley that had been a tomb was now silent, empty, and behind her. The road back stretched long, but she carried with her the weight of 100 lives that would see the dawn. The runway stretched out ahead, dark asphalt glowing in the late sun, but Avery barely saw it. Her eyes flicked between gauges, fuel nearly at fumes, ammo drum empty, countermeasures gone. She brought Falcon 2 down as steady as if she were in a textbook exercise, wheels kissing the ground with a grace that belied the storm she'd just flown through. She taxied slow, careful, the canopy reflecting the hangar lights, and then she noticed the line. They were waiting for her, not just the ground crew or fellow pilots, but everyone. Mechanics in grease-stained coveralls, medics in dusty scrubs, clerks with papers still tucked in their pockets, even cooks with aprons tied crooked. They stood shoulder to shoulder along the flight line, silent, not cheering, not clapping, just saluting. Respect in its rawest form. Avery shut the engine down, the turbine's whine fading into silence that felt louder than war. She climbed from the cockpit, boots hitting the tarmac. The air was thick with heat, fuel, and something else she couldn't quite name. Gravity, perhaps, or history. Her commander, Colonel Hayes, was there at the front. His jaw was set hard, eyes unreadable. As she approached, he spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "You violated orders. You launched unauthorized. You endangered an aircraft and your own life." His tone carried the weight of reprimand, of court-martial whispers already circling. Then he paused. His voice dropped, just enough that only those nearest could catch it. "But you saved 100 Americans." The silence that followed was its own verdict. Hayes didn't smile, but the edge in his eyes softened by a fraction. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass, neither absolving nor condemning her, just recognizing the truth. The inquiry came days later, a formal panel in a cold room. Some argued for punishment, warning of precedent, of discipline eroded if rules were ignored. Others, mostly younger officers, countered with the obvious: doctrine had failed in that valley. Avery's improvisation, born from endless preparation, had succeeded. The record showed what couldn't be denied. 100 commandos had exfiltrated alive with 0 KIA during movement. In the end, the verdict was a compromise: no medals, no parades. A written reprimand for launching unauthorized, quietly filed away. But her tapes, her flight data, her method, all of it was pulled apart, studied, and folded into the manuals. Minimum engagement distances became guidelines, not shackles. Training syllabi added modules she had effectively written in fire. Avery never bragged about it. In classrooms and hangars, when young pilots asked, she told them the same thing every time: skill, preparation, and courage are the real doctrine. Don't wait for permission to be ready. When the moment comes, you won't get a second chance. Months later, a small envelope arrived at her quarters, no return address. Inside was a patch dusty, frayed around the edges. Embroidered on it were the words, "For the one who drew us away home." She held it for a long time, thumb brushing the fabric, the dog tags on her chest cool against her skin. She didn't frame it, didn't display it. She tucked it into a box with her father's old letters, a place where reminders lived quietly. Because the truth was never about glory. It was about the valley that had nearly become a grave, and the choice that turned it into a road home. 100 commandos came home alive because one fighter pilot refused to quit. When every rule said, "Stand down," when the valley was closing in like a tomb, Captain Avery Morgan chose action over silence. Alone, low on fuel, and against impossible odds, she carved a corridor out of fire and dust so that no American would be left behind. That is what true valor looks like. Not medals, not headlines, but courage when the clock has run out and the odds say no. Avery's story is a reminder that preparation, skill, and heart can turn the tide when nothing else can. If this story moved you, salute in the comments below. It's a way to honor not just Avery, but every man and woman who has stood in the gap when lives hung in the balance. Tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing our community of respect and remembrance stretch across the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more true military stories of courage, sacrifice, and valor. Until next time, stay strong, stay proud, and never forget those who serve.